Welcome to part 2 of this week's episode on cooking your roots. Earlier in the week, we did my grandmother's version of cottage pudding. Now this version is delicious and it's really hard to compare it, but to change it up a little bit, show you how it could be a little different, I took the sugar and I replaced it with honey. We are once again going to start with the cake, and we're going to need ingredients for that. So we're going to start with 1.5 cups flour, a half a teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a half a teaspoon baking soda. This is important because we change sugar for honey, and I'll explain that later. 1/4 cup of butter flavored shortening, 2/3 cup of honey, 1 egg, a half a cup of milk, and a teaspoon of vanilla. So in part 1 of this episode, we greased and floured our pan generously. Now that is still a good thing to do in today's society, but to avoid us a hassle, we're just going to use a little bit of parchment paper. As you see, I've cut it down to size so that it fits in perfectly and will make it easy for the cake to come out. There are a couple sides here that don't have any on it, so I'm going to use this oil, and I'm just going to give a light squirt, make sure that the cake doesn't stick to those 2 sides there. So we're going to start by mixing all our dry ingredients together, the flour, salt, baking soda, and baking powder. Now as I said earlier, this baking soda is important. Honey is much more acidic than sugar is, and that acid can impede the rise of our cake. So it is important that we change that balance with this addition of the baking soda. Yes, baking powder does have baking soda in it, and it's essentially baking soda with an acid already combined, but I think it is important that we take the time to add a little bit more baking soda so that we get our rise proper. Now we're going to add our wet ingredients to this, our shortening, the egg, the vanilla, and the milk. We're going to give this a good stir. We want to make sure that this is well incorporated together. We also want to make sure that we use our honey that we've talked about, that I forgot to add. I would also advise using a whisk because this isn't cutting it for me. Now there's a couple changes we made to this recipe because of the honey. As said before, we increased the alkaline using the baking soda, but we also are using less liquid, less milk in this case, because the honey has a lot more liquidity to it. In fact, this batter is slightly more runny than the original, which means we're going to cook it a little bit longer in the oven. So after scraping down all that goodness into the pan, we are going to put this in a 350-degree oven for 30 to 35 minutes, or until the top is no longer jiggling. This will also be a lot more brown than the last one due to the addition of that honey and the crystallization that occurs. And it will result in a cake that is not as sweet, but has a much more rich flavor due to that honey, that floral note. I'm also going to show you a way that we can make the sauce with honey as well, though I wouldn't recommend putting both together. You'd get it kind of overpowered. So either put this sauce with the original cake recipe or put the original sauce with this cake recipe so you get a good balance there. We're going to need 1 cup of honey, 3 tablespoons of cornstarch, 2 cups of water, 4 tablespoons of butter, the juice of 3 limes, and just a teaspoon of grated lime zest. You can see I have a lot more here and it comes to bite me in the future. So to start, we are going to incorporate our items in a saucepan. Start by combining together your water and cornstarch and stir to make sure that there is no residue on the bottom left behind. Now we want to get this to a boil, so we're going to turn it up pretty high here. And then once that is combined and before it gets to a boil, we're going to add our honey. And as soon as that comes to a boil and starts to thicken to the consistency that we want, we are going to turn it off and then incorporate in the rest of our ingredients. Butter, our lime juice, and just a teaspoon of lime zest. Now I over-zested my limes and I got far too much pith in there, and so the result I ended up with was kind of a bitter afternote to the sauce. You don't need that much zest, just a little bit will do. And as soon as your butter is melted, you'll have a rich looking sauce that again is not as sweet as the first and has more of a floral note to it. It's also going to be a lot darker in color because of that honey. So once our cake is done, we're going to take a butter knife and run it along those 2 sides where we don't have that parchment paper. Make sure nothing sticks. And then just see how easy this is to pull out and to lay on a plate. You can leave it on the parchment or you can remove the parchment for a greater presentation if you like. Normally I don't care, but this is for camera, so we'll just get rid of that. Cut it into 9 even squares and place it on a plate, cutting it half and pouring that nice sauce on top. Now, because this isn't as sweet, we're also going to add a little bit of table cream to this, and it enriches the experience and brings everything closer together. This yielded a wonderfully dense cake, but with a good crumb, and almost a caramely texture to the cake. The floral sauce was almost too much on its own, but with the cream, it tastes delicious. This is a good way, an alternate way to make cottage pudding. I used limes this time so you could see how different sauces could be used, but you can use a multitude of fruits or caramels even, or chocolate to make your sauce for your cottage pudding. Take a look at your recipes and see what you would do to take some old recipes and make them new again. Let me know what you think about my changes below in the comments, and subscribe for more of Cooking Your Roots.